The psychological collapse among German forces had actually commenced 3 weeks earlier, on the 7th of March, when something impossible had already occurred once before. A young lieutenant named Karl Timmermann, ironically born in Frankfurt back in 1921 but now fighting under American colours, had led advance elements from the 9th Armoured Division to accomplish what German High Command initially dismissed as enemy propaganda. They had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen completely intact, without the planned demolition successfully destroying it. When those first reports arrived at headquarters, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's staff simply refused to believe them. General Major Karl Wagener, serving as Chief of Staff, would later provide testimony at Nuremberg, describing their initial reaction. They assumed the reports represented deliberate misinformation because no military force could possibly advance with such velocity. No assault could succeed without extensive preparation. Yet within mere hours, American troops poured across that bridge like water bursting through a compromised dam. The bridge itself had been constructed during the previous World War using Russian prisoners as forced labour. German engineers had wired the structure with 2,800 kilograms of demolition charges, enough explosive power to reduce the entire span to twisted wreckage tumbling into the Rhine. When those engineers triggered the detonation sequence, only partial explosions occurred. The charges utilized weak civilian-grade Donnerite explosives that failed catastrophically at the critical moment. Eventually, after 10 days of continuous use and cumulative structural damage, that bridge would indeed collapse, killing 28 American engineers and wounding 93 more. But by that point, the bridge's tactical value had already been fully exploited. The Americans had achieved something that violated every principle of German military doctrine regarding river crossings and defensive positions. Major Hans-Georg Model, serving as an engineer officer with Army Group B and notably the son of Field Marshal Walter Model himself, maintained detailed technical notes throughout this period. On the 15th of March, he observed American engineers assembling what appeared to his trained eye like some enormous mechanical toy across the Rhine's width. He recorded his observations carefully, noting how the Americans and British possessed bridging equipment that assembled with the simplicity of children's building blocks. The Bailey Bridge, developed by British engineer Donald Bailey, who had tinkered with model bridges as a personal hobby before the war, required absolutely no specialized tools or heavy construction equipment for assembly. The components were deliberately designed light enough that standard trucks could transport them and ordinary soldiers could lift them into position manually. Yet somehow these simple pieces were strong enough to support 60-ton tanks rolling across them at speed. Every single piece was completely interchangeable with every other piece, Model wrote in his notes, manufactured to tolerances that German industry couldn't achieve, even in their finest precision factories. What required 3 days for German engineers, American crews accomplished in 3 hours. Tasks that would demand 400 German soldiers were completed by 40 Americans. Watching these crews work resembled observing a carefully choreographed dance performance where every participant knew their exact role without shouted orders or visible confusion. They simply built, piece by piece, with mechanical precision that suggested not military improvisation, but industrial process. The German General Staff had miscalculated Allied capabilities so catastrophically that it defied comprehension. During February of 1945, when German commanders were planning their Rhine defensive strategy, General Oberst Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, had confidently assured his staff that Allied airborne operations would be necessarily limited in scope. Perhaps a single brigade, 2 at absolute maximum, could be deployed by air. The Allies simply lacked the transport capacity for anything larger, he declared, with the certainty of someone who had never witnessed American industrial production firsthand. German intelligence estimates suggested they would face perhaps 7,000 infantry defending any Rhine crossing area. What actually materialized would prove devastating beyond their worst projections. When the night of March 23rd arrived and Allied artillery commenced preparatory bombardment for Operation Plunder, German forward observers began reporting something that challenged their understanding of what artillery bombardment could even mean. 4,000 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously, not sequentially or in rolling barrages, but all at once in perfect coordination. The result was a continuous wall of steel and high explosive that transformed night into artificial day across the entire front. The barrage achieved such intensity that German soldiers positioned 30 kilometers away felt continuous ground tremors for 4 solid hours. Windows shattered in villages 40 kilometers distant from the bombardment zone. What the Allies were accomplishing wasn't traditional artillery support, but something closer to terraforming through explosive force, physically reshaping the terrain through sustained bombardment. At precisely 700 hours on the morning of March 24th, the sky above the Rhine filled with an armada that defied rational description. British forces deployed 322 transport aircraft, carrying 3,837 paratroopers from airbases scattered across East Anglia. Simultaneously, 298 American transport planes lifted off from airfields surrounding Paris, their cargo bays packed with 4,890 paratroopers from the 17th Airborne Division. Behind these transport aircraft came the gliders, and the gliders arrived in numbers that seemed to blot out the sun itself. 906 American Waco gliders carried 4,810 soldiers plus vehicles, artillery pieces, and even light tanks somehow lifted into the air and delivered by glider. The British contributed another 440 Horsa and Hamilcar gliders to this aerial invasion force. The psychological impact on German defenders proved immediate and devastating. Obergefreiter Johann Becker from the 84th Division would later provide testimony describing his unit's reaction. They had witnessed large formations before, certainly. 100-plane bombing raids had become almost routine, but this was fundamentally different in character and scale. The sky literally turned black with aircraft of every description. Transport planes, gliders, fighter escorts, bombers providing suppression. It appeared as though the entire aviation industries of America and Britain had taken flight simultaneously and concentrated over this single sector. Some German soldiers simply sat down where they stood and stared upward in complete shock. Others threw away their weapons entirely, asking themselves and each other what possible point existed in fighting the sky itself. Oberst Wilhelm von Steuben commanded an anti-aircraft regiment positioned near Wessel and faced an impossible tactical problem that no amount of training or experience had prepared him to solve. His regiment had been allocated 114 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 712 light anti-aircraft guns positioned around the expected drop zones. This represented the largest concentration of anti-aircraft defences the Wehrmacht had assembled anywhere since defensive operations around Berlin had commenced, yet these numbers proved utterly meaningless against the scale of what approached. Von Steuben would later write in his memoir about how they had been assured that Allied forces lacked sufficient transport aircraft, that fuel shortages would necessarily limit any airborne operation to token size. Yet the enemy came in numbers that literally darkened the Sunday morning sky. The airlift consisted of 541 transport aircraft and over 1,300 glider and tug aircraft combined. His gunners initially stood transfixed, forgetting to fire their weapons, simply staring upward at this demonstration of apparently infinite resources. When they finally did commence firing, von Steuben compared it to shooting arrows at a thunderstorm. Individual raindrops might be struck, but the storm itself continued regardless. Allied planners had calculated German anti-aircraft capabilities with actuarial precision, treating the problem like insurance risk assessment rather than military uncertainty. They knew exactly how many aircraft German guns could theoretically engage under optimal conditions. They sent 3 times that number, ensuring that even worst-case attrition would still allow mission success. Massive flak suppression operations by fighter bombers in the hours preceding the main transport wave had cratered gun positions and destroyed ammunition supplies. When German anti-aircraft batteries did manage to fire effectively, They faced a terrible tactical dilemma with no good solution. Engage the slow-moving transport aircraft and be immediately destroyed by the fighter escorts, or engage the fighters and watch helplessly as transports delivered their cargo unmolested. The gliders themselves represented a revolution in military logistics that no German commander had anticipated or prepared defensive doctrine to counter. British Hamilcar gliders, the giants among the assault force, carried M22 Locust tanks specifically designed for airborne operations. These tanks weighed just 6.7 tons with armour only 12.5 millimeters thick, but mounted gyro-stabilized 37mm guns capable of engaging German positions immediately upon landing. German tactical doctrine, refined through years of hard experience across every theatre, held definitively and without exception that tanks could not be delivered by air. Yet here they descended from the sky like steel rainfall, violating every established principle. General Major Eugen Meindl, one of Germany's most experienced paratroop commanders and a pioneer in developing airborne warfare doctrine, observed the operation from his command post 10 kilometers distant from the primary drop zones. His reaction, carefully recorded by his aide-de-camp, revealed professional devastation mixed with bitter recognition. Germany had invented airborne warfare, he noted. They had shown the world what was possible at Rotterdam, at Eben Emael, at Crete. German paratroopers had written the textbook on vertical envelopment. But what unfolded before his eyes came from no textbook he recognized. This wasn't military art or operational creativity. This was industrial brutality applied to warfare. The enemy had manufactured an airborne assault with the same systematic processes that Krupp used to manufacture steel or IG Farben used to manufacture chemicals. Quantity had achieved its own form of quality through sheer overwhelming mass. The operational speed shattered every assumption embedded in German military doctrine and staff college teaching. German defensive planning, refined through 5 years of continuous combat across multiple theatres, assumed that any airborne force would require at minimum 24 hours to consolidate after landing. This assumption was based on their own extensive experiences and careful observations from Crete, Sicily, and Normandy. Scattered drops, confused units, lost equipment containers, these were considered inevitable friction inherent to airborne operations. The Allies had solved these problems not through superior tactics, but through overwhelming mass and meticulous industrial planning. Unlike Operation Market Garden 6 months earlier, where drops were spread over multiple days across 60 miles, the entire Operation Varsity Force was delivered simultaneously in a single massive lift concentrated in an area measuring just 5 miles by 6 miles. Within 3 hours of the first parachute's opening, Allied airborne forces had secured all their primary objectives. German counterattack forces, assembled and positioned based on that 24-hour consolidation assumption, arrived to discover fortified positions already established, anti-tank guns emplaced and ready, and airborne forces beginning their own offensive operations rather than defending desperately. But the bridges were what truly broke German morale at the deepest psychological level. Within hours of securing initial bridgeheads, Allied engineers commenced constructing Bailey bridges with unprecedented speed that defied everything German engineers understood about river crossing operations. The Bailey bridge system was a masterpiece of engineering deliberately reduced to its simplest possible form. Every single piece was completely interchangeable. Every joint was identical. Every panel could connect to every other panel without modification. No piece was unique or specialized. No particular skills were required beyond basic training that any soldier could master in hours. At Rees, 25 kilometers north of Wessel, the Royal Canadian Engineers began constructing what would be designated Blackfriars Bridge on March 26th. The bridge would ultimately stretch 1,803 feet across the Rhine, making it the longest Bailey bridge constructed anywhere to that point in history. German observers watched in complete disbelief as the bridge grew at a rate of 70 feet per hour. 227 truckloads of bridging equipment arrived in perfect sequence, each truck positioned exactly where needed. 9,500 man-hours of labour were organised with such efficiency that no worker stood idle for more than seconds at a time. After the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17th, killing those 28 American engineers, United States forces had simply shifted operations to other crossing sites without any visible disruption to their timeline. Within hours, they completed a treadway bridge 600 metres downstream from the collapsed structure. Within days, a pontoon bridge appeared, then a Bailey Bridge, then another Bailey Bridge, then another and another, each appearing with mechanical regularity. The Rhine, which had protected Germanic peoples for 2,000 years, which had stopped Caesar's legions and Napoleon's armies, was being crossed as casually as some village stream. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, recognized as one of Germany's most successful armoured commanders, visited the front positions on March 25th. His report back to Field Marshal Model was remarkably stark and honest. The Americans had transformed bridging from an engineering challenge into a simple mathematical problem with predetermined solutions. While German engineers calculated each timber's load-bearing capacity, measured each span precisely, considered each stress factor individually, the Americans simply trucked in prefabricated sections and connected them according to formula. The Bailey Bridge could be modified for different lengths and load requirements without changing basic components. Single configuration for light loads, double for medium weight, triple for the heaviest tanks. They had removed art from engineering entirely and replaced it with simple multiplication. The psychological collapse among German troops was accelerating daily now. Units that had fought tenaciously for months began surrendering en masse without significant resistance. The 2nd Parachute Regiment, elite troops who had jumped at Crete during Germany's greatest airborne triumph, simply laid down their weapons when confronted with the reality of what they now faced. On the afternoon of March 24th, after airborne forces had been on the ground less than 8 hours, 240 American B-24 Liberator bombers appeared at 400 feet altitude. They weren't conducting bombing operations, they were delivering supplies. 600 tons of supplies dropped by parachute directly to the airborne forces already on the ground. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, replacement weapons, everything an army needed delivered from the sky. German logistics officers calculated that this single supply drop exceeded what an entire German corps might receive in a full month of sustained combat operations. When Field Marshal Model received confirmation that the Allies had dropped 2 complete divisions in a single morning with more forces arriving by glider every hour, he reportedly sat in complete silence for several minutes before speaking. "Then the war is truly lost," he finally said. "We are not fighting armies anymore. We are fighting the entire productive capacity of America itself." The integration of airborne and ground forces proceeded with clockwork precision that German doctrine insisted was simply impossible to achieve. By the afternoon of March 24th, less than 8 hours after the first parachute opened over German territory, the British 15th Scottish Division had established direct contact with both airborne divisions. Ground forces that had crossed the Rhine in assault boats during the night were shaking hands with paratroopers who had landed that same morning. German military theory, based on hard-won experience at Crete, where German paratroopers had required days to become combat effective after landing, held that airborne forces needed at minimum 48 hours to organise after touching down. Allied forces were combat effective within hours of landing, some units within mere minutes. The C-46 commando aircraft employed in Operation Varsity represented another level of American industrial adaptation and resource allocation. These aircraft could carry 36 paratroopers, an entire platoon compared to 18 in the older C-47s. German Junkers, Ju-52 transports, which had served since the Spanish Civil War, could manage 18 paratroopers maximum. The Americans were delivering airborne forces at double the rate Germany had ever achieved, even at the absolute height of German airborne operations back in 1941. But the C-46 had a fatal design flaw that revealed American attitudes toward acceptable casualties in warfare. The aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. When struck by anti-aircraft fire, they burst into flames immediately. 19 of 72 C-46s were lost on March 24th, 14 burning in mid-air with paratroopers still aboard, unable to escape. Yet the operation continued without any pause whatsoever. The Americans had calculated probable losses beforehand and sent sufficient aircraft to absorb them. They treated human tragedy as statistical probability, acceptable losses in an industrial equation. The sheer variety of specialized equipment stunned German professionals who understood that each piece of equipment represented years of development, extensive testing, and massive capital investment. Germany had prototypes and experimental concepts. The Allies had production lines churning out hundreds of each type in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. When the Luftwaffe attempted to interfere with Operation Varsity, the results proved catastrophic for German forces despite their best efforts. They had assembled 375 single-engine fighters, 260 twin-engine fighters, and 40 of their precious Messerschmitt Me-262 jets for what they hoped would constitute a decisive intervention. They managed to shoot down 56 Allied aircraft, including 21 transport planes. But the Allies had sent over 3,000 aircraft in total. The loss rate was less than 2%. The Allies simply absorbed these losses and continued operations without any visible impact on mission success. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former General der Jagdflieger and Germany's most famous fighter commander, observed the operation from a position near Münster. "We could see them coming from 50 kilometers away," he later recounted. Thousands of aircraft in perfect formation. "We had perhaps 30 operational fighters in the entire sector. It was like throwing pebbles at an avalanche. They didn't even alter course when we attacked them. They simply continued their mission, accepting losses as a normal cost of doing business." The human cost was real and substantial, but treated with industrial detachment that shocked German observers. The 17th Airborne Division suffered 159 killed, 522 wounded, and 840 missing in just the first day. The British 6th Airborne suffered similar casualty rates. Combined, over 2,000 Allied airborne soldiers became casualties on March 24th alone. Yet these losses, which would have destroyed German airborne capability for months and required extensive reconstitution, were absorbed without affecting operational tempo. Reserve units were already prepared and positioned. Replacement equipment was already loaded and ready. The machine continued without pause. German elite units fared even worse by comparison. The 7th and 8th Fallschirmjäger Divisions, Germany's premier paratrooper formations that had executed the assault on Crete, had been reduced through months of grinding combat to barely 900 men each. They watched from their defensive positions as the Allies dropped 20 times their number in a single morning. These weren't elite troops carefully selected and trained for years. Many American paratroopers had been civilians just 18 months earlier. Yet they descended from the sky in numbers that made individual quality completely irrelevant. The bridges kept appearing with mechanical regularity. The 148th Engineer Combat Battalion, with assistance from additional supporting units, built a 1,258-foot floating Bailey Bridge at Remagen in less than 2 days, finishing at 7:15 hours on March 20th. German engineers calculated such a bridge should require at least 2 full weeks to construct even with experienced crews. The Americans used soldiers who had been civilians 1 year earlier. At Bad Honigen, 9 kilometers upstream from Remagen, the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion constructed another tactical bridge on March 22nd. At Wallach, the 17th Armoured Engineer Battalion built a heavy pontoon bridge capable of carrying the heaviest tanks in the American arsenal. At Rheinberg, another Bailey Bridge appeared. At Buderich, a railroad bridge was converted for vehicle traffic. Each bridge appeared faster than the last, as engineers refined their procedures through practice, turning construction from an engineering challenge into pure industrial process. The medical support for the airborne operation demonstrated yet another dimension of Allied material superiority that German forces couldn't match. Field hospitals were dropped by glider with the assault waves. Operating theatres, X-ray machines, blood banks and pharmaceutical supplies that German frontline units hadn't seen since 1942 were delivered by air to forces actively in combat. Penicillin, the miracle drug that Germany knew existed but couldn't produce in meaningful quantity, was distributed freely to Allied wounded. Morphine was abundant. Plasma was available by the litre. Communication systems represented yet another unbridgeable gulf between the two militaries. Radio sets by the hundreds, telephone wire by thousands of meters, signal equipment of every conceivable type, all dropped in quantities that German forces could never match. The Allies had achieved something German signal officers considered theoretically impossible: reliable communication between airborne forces and supporting artillery from the very moment of landing. German forces, meanwhile, often relied on runners and signal flags, methods essentially unchanged since the First World War. The two airborne divisions involved in Operation Varsity captured approximately 3,000 German soldiers while suffering roughly 2,000 casualties themselves. Many Germans surrendered not from cowardice, but from rational recognition of the complete futility of continued resistance. They had watched the sky fill with aircraft beyond counting, seen bridges appear overnight where rivers should have been barriers, observed unlimited supplies delivered by air. Resistance seemed not just futile, but absurd. By March 27th, the Allied bridgehead measured 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. German doctrine called for immediate counterattacks to eliminate bridgeheads before they could consolidate their positions. But the Allies consolidated faster than German forces could concentrate for counterattacks. By the end of March, all 4 United States armies fighting in Western Europe were across the Rhine. The 1st Army under Courtney Hodges, the 3rd Army under George Patton, the 9th Army under William Simpson, the 15th Army under Leonard Gero. Each crossing was supported by bridges that appeared with mechanical regularity, suggesting industrial scheduling rather than military improvisation. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, one of Germany's most experienced tank commanders who had fought continuously from Poland through Normandy, summed up the German officer corps' collective realization in stark terms. "We prepared for the wrong war entirely," he stated. "We trained for battles of maneuver, for operational art, for the clash of professional armies. The Americans brought something fundamentally different. They brought Detroit, they brought Pittsburgh, they brought the entire industrial might of a continent and dropped it on our heads from the sky." The speed of Allied advance after the Rhine crossings was unprecedented in modern warfare. German units that had held defensive lines for months collapsed in days. It wasn't military defeat in the traditional sense of being outfought or outmaneuvered. It was psychological collapse in the face of unlimited productive capacity. Soldiers who had endured years of combat, who had survived the Eastern Front, who had fought from Africa to the Arctic Circle, simply gave up when confronted with the reality of American resources applied systematically. On March 30th, Field Marshal Walter Model held his final staff conference at his headquarters in the Ruhr Pocket. According to his Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wagener, Model addressed his officers with unusual candour. "Gentlemen, we have witnessed the future of warfare, and we are not part of it. The Americans have made war a problem of production management. They schedule battles like train timetables. They deliver armies like cargo shipments. They build bridges like automobiles on assembly lines. We are watching the death not just of the Wehrmacht, but of war as we understood it." Model issued his final order dissolving Army Group B on April 15, 1945. 6 days later, on April 21st, rather than face surrender, he walked alone into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. His last written words were simple and devastating. "The enemy's material superiority has become overwhelming. Further resistance is futile." It served as an epitaph not just for an army, but for an entire concept of how wars were fought and won. By April 10th, even before Model's final order, Army Group B had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr Pocket, representing the largest capitulation of German forces in the entire war. Many had not been defeated in pitched battle. They had simply recognized the complete futility of fighting an enemy with apparently unlimited resources. The bridges remained standing after the war ended, monuments to American industrial methodology. German engineer officers, now prisoners of war, were sometimes employed to help dismantle them. Each bridge was identical to every other bridge of the same type. Each joint was perfect. Each span was precise. They stood as physical symbols of a new kind of warfare where victory was determined not on battlefields, but in factories, not by generals, but by production managers. General Franz Halder, the former chief of the General Staff, conducted a comprehensive post-war study of Allied bridging operations for the United States Army Historical Division. His conclusion was remarkably stark. The Allied bridge-building capacity represented the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. They did not outfight us tactically. They outproduced us industrially. They turned the Rhine from Germany's primary defensive shield into merely another production problem to be solved through systematic processes. In 1950, General Oberst Kurt Student, the founder of German airborne forces, who had personally planned and executed the attacks on Eben Emael and Crete, wrote a final assessment of Operation Varsity for historical purposes. We created airborne warfare at Eben Emael in 1940. We perfected it at Crete in 1941. The Americans and British industrialized it over the Rhine in 1945. They took our innovation and made it routine production. They transformed the extraordinary into the ordinary. That is precisely how they won the war. Not through superior tactics or operational strategy, but through the ability to mass-produce military solutions. The German officers who personally witnessed Operation Varsity and the Rhine crossings never psychologically recovered from the experience. They had seen warfare transformed from a contest of will and professional skill into a problem of production management and resource allocation. In a single day, the Allies had dropped more paratroopers than Germany had employed in the entire war across all theatres combined. They had built bridges faster than Germany could possibly destroy them. They had made the impossible routine through systematic application of overwhelming resources. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 marked far more than a military defeat for Germany in the conventional sense. They represented the complete psychological demolition of the German officer corps' entire worldview and professional identity. Everything they believed about warfare, about rivers as natural barriers, about the inherent limitations of airborne forces, about the paramount importance of operational art, was shattered comprehensively by the overwhelming application of productive capacity to military problems. In the final analysis, German leaders had never imagined that American engineers would drop bridges from the sky and assemble them overnight because they had never conceived of warfare itself as fundamentally a production problem. They had prepared for battles and found themselves confronting assembly lines. They had trained for war as they understood it through centuries of European military tradition, and discovered that America had changed the very definition of what war meant. The bridges across the Rhine stood as monuments not to military genius or tactical brilliance, but to industrial methodology, systematic planning, and mass production applied to warfare. They were not built by warriors in the traditional sense, but by engineers following standardized procedures with completely interchangeable parts. And in that transformation lay both Germany's ultimate defeat and the future character of warfare itself, forever changed from an art requiring genius and courage to a science requiring only productive capacity and systematic procedures executed with industrial efficiency. The German commanders who had spent entire lifetimes mastering the traditional art of war discovered in those terrible days of March 1945 that their art had become completely obsolete. Production had won decisively. The factory had defeated the battlefield. Mass output had triumphed comprehensively over military tradition and professional expertise. The bridges still stood when the war ended 6 weeks later, perfect in their standardized uniformity, identical in their systematic construction. They served as monuments to a new age where wars would be won not by better soldiers, but by better factories, not by superior individual courage, but by superior industrial production, not by military genius, but by productive capacity applied systematically. They were bridges not just across the Rhine River, but from one historical era of warfare to an entirely different one, from the age of warriors to the age of production lines, from military art to industrial science.